Ruderman Family Foundation is doing an amazing amount of work in terms of empowering and funding inclusion in Jewish communities across this country and in other places, Israel as well. One of the things they've managed to do, and I think some of my Jewish friends would call this a miracle as well, is to bring together people from all Jewish denominations together, working together in a number of ways. And they are the sponsors for this plenary session and for our speakers being with us. The first for the Summer Institute, and a relationship we hope that will continue. But without further ado, Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bill, for the warm introduction. And like Bill, I'd like to extend my tremendous thanks and gratitude to the Ruderman Family Foundation that has sponsored today's plenary and made possible this conversation, and also provided financial support for scholarships and helped to underwrite the participation of some rabbinical students. So it's really a wonderful thing to see as the Institute moves even more fully into its longstanding commitment to interreligious conversation, to have the Ruderman Family Foundation as a tremendous partner for us in that. So today's conversation is designed with one of the Ruderman family's most cherished values in mind, that is bringing together the issue of disability, advocacy, and inclusion with a commitment to Jewish pluralism and a conversation of many voices. So we've put together this plenary today to be a kind of conversation between a number of speakers coming out of Jewish tradition, right? With each of us invited to speak from our own particularity as well. So in terms of the order of events, I'll be introducing our first speaker. I'll then introduce our second, and then she will speak. I'll introduce our second speaker, and then he will speak. Then the three of us will have a little bit of conversation before we open it up to conversation with all of you. So if you would, feel free, if you're so inclined, to hold your questions or your things you'd like to know more about until the end, so that we can really have what I hope is a rich conversation in multiple voices. So it is my pleasure today to introduce as our first speaker, Sharon Shapiro-Lax. Sharon is the founding director of Yad HaZakah, the Jewish Disability Empowerment Center. She has over 25 years of leadership and tremendous work in independent living, disability advocacy movement, and her particular work at Yad HaZakah is to bring the insights of independent living, grassroots advocacy, and peer-to-peer work to Torah observant, that is Orthodox Jewish communities, and to the wider Jewish world. Sharon Shapiro-Lax is a tremendously accomplished leader. She has widespread experience on boards and in both the Jewish and the disability world. I'd like to lift up just a couple of accomplishments today. She has been involved in a 20-year struggle to implement the Help America Vote Act and extend rent increase exemptions to people with disabilities in New York City. So a real person who has the capacity to couple profound spiritual insight with very tangible, on-the-ground, concrete work of building a better and more just world. Please join me in welcoming Sharon Shapiro-Lax.
the Ruderman Foundation and all the sponsors involved in putting on this wonderful gathering. Our quest to understand disability within theology cuts to the core of what disability movements are all about, because if we don't understand how God relates to people with disabilities, what He expects from us and what He expects from the community, we don't have a real underpinning to base our disability advocacy work in any other sector. So we finally worked from the bottom up. We started in the secular world, and now we're reaching the essential heart of where inclusion and access begins, which is within God. Okay, I just want to begin by saying that my relationship with God began very young, basically when I was an infant. I used to close my eyes and feel like I came from another dimension. I never really felt a part of this world. I felt like I was planted here for some reason, a reason I didn't know, and that my parents were these beings assigned somehow to take care of me for the time being. But I always sensed that there was another realm from which I emanated. I felt this throughout my youth, and I tested different ways of connecting with this being who I found out later we refer to as God. Later in my teens, I grew up in a secular Jewish home, and I started attending what are known as Shabbatonim, where people would get together for Shabbos and learn and celebrate Shabbos together. And I became Torah observant in my 20s. I presented many challenging questions, but the one thing that convinced me of the validity of Torah was the mitzvah, the commandment that we recently read about in the Torah, which is forgetting when you're collecting weeds and you drop a sheath of wheat and incidentally, you're not allowed to pick up that sheets of wheat. That comparatively little sheets of wheat should be left for the poor. And I was thinking about governments and the laws we enact. And I could imagine a human government coming up with payout, which is leaving a corner of your field for the poor. I could conceive of that. But what I couldn't conceive of was the government coming up with something that you happened to drop, and commanding you not to pick it up, to leave it for the poor. I just saw something so divine in that. And that's when I began to decide, among other reasons, I want to observe a Torah observant life. My husband and I got married in 1983, and this is my beloved partner. Okay, and we went to Israel for the first time for our honeymoon. At the time when we went to Israel, it was in 1984. It was very inaccessible. There was one site that I went to that had this stupid step that went up, across, and down. I couldn't. That little step made me question, God, you have mitzvot in the Torah relating to that sheath that fell. You have mitzvot in the Torah relating to the poor, to the widow, to the orphan. Where do I belong? And when I say I, whenever I say I mean my sisters and brothers with physical, hearing, vision, intellectual, mental health disabilities. Where do I, the big I, belong? And this led me to the question that if the Torah is God's blueprint for the universe, as it says in Midrash Rabbah, Bereshit, how can it not address disability, access, and accommodation? This resulted in my quest to discover Torah's response to disability. I don't know.
Always the bearer of bad news.
Okay. So, I am going to make a much longer says that the Orthodoxy gives greater weight to obligations than it does to human rights. In Torah, we say we are obligated to serve Hashem. We are obligated to be sensitive to our fellow human being. Okay. So, oh boy, how do you put this in 2 minutes? Okay. Can I give it over? I won't give it over to my best half because he won't do it quicker than I will.
Which one?
He's my Aaron.
I'm a living, breathing accommodation.
These two.
Which two? All right. See, we didn't rehearse it like that. A challenge, given the fact that Orthodox Judaism is rooted in its commitment to the traditional ways of learning from the sources, to making decisions based on the prevailing positions of prior generations, and to upholding the esteem of rabbinical leaders of our time, how do we, in accordance with traditional Jewish learning and practice, encourage the leadership in Orthodox communities to acknowledge, invite, and accommodate people with disabilities? The Orthodox Jewish paradigm does not base its decisions on human rights per se. The Torah way of life revolves around obligations between human and God, and human, as well as what is reflective of God and God's will, and what is not. For example, the poor have no right to support, but individuals have the obligation to set aside portions of their fields and to leave forgotten sheaves to the poor. Obligations carry more gravitas than rights in a very key way. Obligations require accountability to one another. Obligations commanded by God, both towards God and our fellow human beings, are immutable, whereas rights are subject to changing human values and are changeable. Understanding the nature and degree of obligation and responsibility to one another and God in different cases and situations is therefore important in determining how we go about making Orthodox Jewish communities more accessible and inclusive. For example, how does a community allocate its limited resources, for example, when choosing to make a mikvah, a ritual bath, wheelchair accessible? That may take a priority over making a particular synagogue accessible if there are several synagogues. Because we have to respect the limited resources of a community.
And because a woman going to a mikvah has more, how shall I say, weight in terms of mitzvah than a man or woman going to the synagogue. So that would be one factor in choosing if I have to do this or that. What do I choose?
Priority doesn't mean the obligation doesn't exist, by the way. It takes everybody's needs into consideration. Well, we cannot review the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America's resolution. It's in your packet. Sharon was consulted by the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, to draft and author what I would say is 98% of this resolution. It is the first of its kind in the Orthodox universe that reflects the general attitude of a rabbinical leadership toward the obligations toward people with disabilities that I know of its kind. So.
Have a look.
Sharon, thank Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker, Rabbi Darby Jared Leigh, a native New Yorker who loves the mountains, who's the rabbi of Congregation Kerem Shalom in Concord, Massachusetts. Rabbi Leigh is a widely respected speaker, rabbi, and teacher. He was recently honored as one of the Forward's most inspiring rabbis of 2016. He's also a passionate snowboarder and a former leading actor with the National Theater of the Deaf. Some of you may have seen him featured in the documentary A Place for All, Faith and Community for People with Disabilities. If you didn't catch him there, perhaps you saw him perform on stage with rock and roll bands Jane's Addiction and Twisted Sister. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Darby Leigh.
Everybody understand me okay? Yes. Anybody hear sign? Can you understand me? What's on? Anybody hear your pen on yourself? Go give it that. I'm going to speak if that's okay. Yes? Yes. Yes. The interpreter. All right.
It's a tough task.
So just like Sharon, I'm used to doing this in 2 or 3 days seminars. I first want to start, of course, by thanking you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you to Bill for the invitation to be here as well. Thank you to the interpreters for making my access today possible. And of course, thank you to the Ruderman Family Foundation for that a lot. For making my presence today, our presence today possible, as well as my access to the event. So I'm not exactly sure if my remarks are in line with what you had in mind or what you had hoped, but I'll start talking, and once you start about talking, I'll get stopped at some point. So I'm gonna try to give you a whole lot of information in a very short amount of time, which means that I'm likely to speak more quickly as I go on. If at any point I start to speak too fast or I'm no longer intelligible, you can no longer understand me, please give us a little wave and tell me to slow down just a little bit, and I'll be happy to do that. Sound good? We're going to work together.
Yes.
All right. So, as you may have gleaned from the opening, 20 seconds of my remarks, I'm a little different. I'm a little bit odd. And I suppose that many of us gathered in this room feel as though we're a little bit different and we're a little bit odd. But I'm going to share with you some of the things that I think make me a little bit odd. And it's not just because I'm a rabbi who's like heavy metal music. And it's not just because I'm a rabbi who found out in a mosh pit. And it's not just because I came out of New York Hardcore Punk Scene in Manhattan. But I think I'm odd for a lot of different reasons as well. And it's not just because I'm deaf. It's because I represent a sort of an odd, an audience, if you will, within the deaf community itself. The fact of the matter is, I despise, you see a theme here, by the way, in defiance and rebelliousness in the whole heavy metal. I despise every single social statistical norm when it comes to deafness. 90% of deaf children born in North America are born to hearing parents who have no other connection to the deaf community and no other association to deafness. Both of my parents are deaf. So that already puts me in the 10%. See, define, right? So I already define a majority. So I'm in the 10% already as it is of deaf children born in North America to deaf parents. Of that 10%, I'm in an incredibly tiny percentage because the majority of those 10% will in fact raise their children in a predominantly ASL, Emmanuel Sign Language Home, send their kids to residential or local schools for the deaf, go on to Gallaudet, and pretty much work and live in the deaf community of North America. My parents made a choice that was slightly controversial one at a time, still a controversial one today, which was to see what they could do to try to give me as much access and exposure to auditory language and training, auditory language and access as much as possible. So my deafness was identified in my infancy, which was very unusual at the time I was done before in history. By the way, I'll get back to that. So I had hearing aids put on me, and I spent the next 16 years of my life in speech therapy and speech training to learn how to use hearing aid and use my quote-unquote visual hearing effectively, as well as to be able to communicate in spoken language in an intelligible manner in order to be understood by different people. At about 16 years of age, the therapy kicked in, and I said, no more! I'm done with that. And I rejected going to speech therapy at that point. But at that point, I think the language foundation had already been established. I was mainstreamed for my entire early education. I was mainstreamed at school for the deaf, at school for the hearing. I wasn't the only deaf student at the school that I grew up at. I ended up going to college at the University of Rochester, not RIT NCIE, which has a very strong deaf program, but the University of Rochester. I did, however, spend my junior year at the University in Washington, D.C. More about that when we come back to it. I spent 3 years as a professional actor with the National Theater of the Deaf. I worked as a social worker with the New York Society for the Deaf. I went to graduate school at Columbia and then went to medical school at the RRC, the Reconstruction Medical College. The only comment I want to make is that the phenomenon of deafness in the human experience is in its most rapid state of evolution, as is evident with most human beings have been on the planet for the past 150 years, give or take, have been the most rapid state of evolution for our understanding of what it means, for what the phenomenon of deafness in the human experience actually means. That was my first 5 minutes. I'm on schedule! There are some Jews in the room, but I understand we are a very diverse and multi-faith community gathering here this morning. So I assume some of you may know this, but others of you may not. The Jewish world is very diverse. The Jewish world reflects an incredible spectrum and incredible diversity. We roughly categorize Jews along this spectrum of what is the denomination, which is, of course, artificial, but we like to categorize things, so we create these artificial categories. You may be familiar, some of you may be familiar with some of these words that refer to the different Jewish denominations along the Jewish spectrum. We have in Judaism renewal Jews. We have Jews who are Reconstructionists. We have Jews who are Reformed. We have Jews who identify as conservative. We have Jews who identify as Orthodox, modern Orthodox, Haredi. We have Jews who are unaffiliated altogether, who don't identify with any of these denominations. We have Jews who identify themselves as post-denominational. They're actually a generation that's moving beyond the artificial divisions in our community. There are Jews who identify as cultural, as secular, as totally non-religious. And of course, we have Jews who are, whether they want to admit it or not, self-hating and actually hate their Jewish identity. So guess what? The deaf community has the exact same spectrum. In the deaf community, we also have. So, by the way, are people roughly familiar with this category that I mentioned, with Reformed, conservative, Orthodox? I don't want to take my valuable time to explain this, but you find me absolutely happy to try to explain. The deaf community in North America reflects the exact same spectrum of diversity. So within the deaf community of North America, we have deaf folks who are renewal, deaf folks who are reformed, deaf folks who are conservative, not Jewish, but in terms of their deafness, in terms of their deaf identity. We have deaf folks who are Orthodox, and we have deaf folks who are Haredi, also Orthodox, you might say, and we of course have deaf folks who are self-hating and hate their deaf identity, and the fact that their life experience is that of death. I would roughly divide this spectrum of the deaf experience in North America into very broad, very overly generalized categories, one with a capital D and one with a lowercase d. So you may have seen or come across in literature about deafness that deaf community folks tend to identify their deafness with a capital D. So capital D deaf is what we would refer to as sort of culturally deaf. People who are completely and fully integrated to the deaf community in every way, shape, or form. In terms of language access, in terms of culture, in terms of social norms and behavior, in terms of art, in terms of theater, in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of concerns, in terms of community and who lives together, in terms of relationships, friendships, marriage, family, and so on. Folks who define their deafness with a capital D are those who see deafness as a cultural experience in the human experience, a cultural phenomenon in the human experience. And then there, of course, are those who identify their deafness with a lowercase d. That is more traditionally, I think today the categories are all a little bit fluid, of course, but I think the lowercase d is sort of more traditionally understood pathological, the medical model, understanding deafness solely as a disability or deafness as a human condition. That is the inability to hear. That's all that means. There isn't anything without that. And by the way, according to the lowercase d model, if you can fix the inability to hear, it pretty much solves the definition, right? Because what is that perspective? The only thing that's really going on is you can't hear. So if I can give you a cochlear implant or hearing aids, give you access to auditory information, I'm more or less taking care of your deafness, and that's before we function, before we communicate and we're lost in that, right? Not true, by the way. You're always still deaf. But those are the two rough, broad categories of deafness, I think, as experienced in North America. Not in it, I think there will be somewhere that at least some folks know a little bit about what I'm talking about. People know a little bit. And on that note, I have not been able to sleep for the last 12 hours. So who watched television last night? Anybody watch the show? Dancing with the Stars? Nobody? Okay, hold on. Please raise your hand if you have been at all following the show Dancing with the Stars this particular season. That is a really small number. I thought I defied social statistical norms. Although, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, but that being said, the individual who just won the reality show, Dancing with the Stars, is now DeMarco, a profoundly deaf individual who communicates exclusively in Youth American Sign Language, who graduated class of 2011 from Yale University of the Deaf, and happens to be best friends with my stepfather's granddaughter. You kick it out. I'd like you to think. Okay, now I'm sorry, I know I got 5 minutes, but I got I'm 30 seconds off. What I just want to say before I wrap up that 5 minutes section is this issue between capital D death and lowercase d death is very live and very ongoing one today. We know because the Washington Post published an article in support of now DeMarco, the deaf dancer on Dancing with the Stars, about 3 months or so ago, give or take. And the president of the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf, the organization that would look at deafness in the lowercase d, wrote a letter of it's a complicated letter. The letter of objection, I suppose, and not so much objection, whether she just wanted everybody to know that although now we get most of the attention and publicity and use American Sign Language exclusively, that we are in fact changing what deafness means in the landscape, and that oral, auditory, language, and access is in fact the way of the future for deaf people, and we are seeing sign language sort of diminish and that's becoming less and less relevant. And it was a horribly offensive letter from the capital D deaf community perspective. Until the capital D deaf community wrote a letter that rebutted Meredith Sugar's letter, and that sort of back and forth campaign just been happening in the last 2 or 3 months. So these issues are very loud in the deaf community. Okay, my last 5 minutes. My earliest Jewish experiences, I was at Temple Metro for the Deaf, a deaf synagogue that met in the basement of a Belser synagogue in Jackson Heights. I always have wondered why we were in the basement. I always remember walking into the synagogue and seeing this really big, beautiful sanctuary, red velvet, comfy chairs, and then we walked down into the basement. It was horrible. Lighting, tiny room, comfortable chairs, and I never quite understood why we as a deaf community were meeting in the basement. Eventually, they didn't offer a Hebrew school, so I was eventually transferred to Central Synagogue, a Reformed synagogue in Manhattan, where I was not exactly the only deaf student, but for all intents and purposes, the only deaf student. My sister was profoundly hearing, who was fully hearing, was preparing to have her bat mitzvah, a rite of passage ceremony at the age of 12 or 13, and the synagogue refused to provide standing interpreters for my parents. So the question was, we'd like to understand what's going on, especially for our daughter's bat mitzvah, will the synagogue decide they have no interpreters? And the answer from the rabbi at the time was, no, we will not. So I experienced, you can figure it out. So my experience Jewishly in my earlier years was somewhat of a, yes, you're Jewish and you're not fully in the Jewish community somehow. We don't really have the ability to create full access to the basis of our synagogue, but not so much in the main sanctuary of our synagogue. I identify as a truth seeker. Someone in the middle of high school, I became really interested in finding out what truth means for me and in a very most personal way. As part of my exploration of truth, I ended up majoring in world religion. So I spent, as an undergrad, I spent time studying everybody else's religion except mine. Why? Because Judaism, things will change a little bit later on, as you can see. And then at the New York Society for the Deaf, I had the opportunity to work on a phenomenal program called the March of the Living, a Holocaust educational program, which I did out another time. I ultimately, after that program, went back to New York and signed out to pursue graduate studies, but focused a little bit more on Judaism, the truth and the love that I found in every graduate degree at Columbia. At Columbia, I thought about, well, academia wasn't exactly where I was headed, and my spirit is strong. I wanted to sing, I wanted to dance, I wanted to play, I wanted to make people laugh, I wanted to hang out, I wanted to be in community, I wanted to get engaged with people in real life, in real life issues, as we figure out what it means to be being alive in this world today. And I thought about, oh, gee, maybe rabbinical school isn't as hard for me. Columbia, JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, there's some JTS students here today. Yes? Yes. JTS, represent. So there is, JTS is one of the Columbia affiliated schools. So at the time, this is now, you have to understand chronologically when we're talking about this is late 90s, early 2000s. This is actually 2000, year 2000. So 16 years ago, I took the director of admission at JTS and said, I am a profoundly deaf student. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University, becoming more and more interested in my Jewish identity. I have to considering pursuing rabbinic path. I need to learn Hebrew, I need to learn Torah, I need to learn Tanakh. There is so much I need to learn. I'm wondering if JTS might be a good place for me to do some of this Torah learning. The message I was given explicitly, literally, word for word, in the year 2000 was, I'm sorry, we don't have anything here for people like you. At the time, please understand, my dreadlocks were down to my knees. My first reaction, of course, was, people like me? What, people with dreadlocks? Dreadlocks in rabbinical school? Anyway, so that's again the message that it gives me that Judaism, the Orthodox Jewish community, maybe didn't have a space for people like me, and wasn't prepared in the year 2000 necessarily to take accommodations to figure out what it means for me to become a participant in the community. I know I'm a minute over time. I've got 3 more things I want to go for. Can I? I'm doing it. All right. I'm 1 minute over. Very sorry. I did my best. So as I began to study, I finally was admitted to the Reform Seminary, the Reconstruction Seminary, and made the choice to attend the Reconstruction Seminary. And I began to learn more and more about the death experience in Judaism and learned that there are values of rabbinic prohibition against a deaf person's full participation in Jewish communal, religious, and spiritual life. Volumes of rabbinic prohibition, all of which I think are easy to be understood in their social historical context. Nevertheless, I began to realize that Judaism had in fact rejected deaf participation for some understandable and some not so understandable reasons. But again, now go back to where I started. I am what? An anti-authoritarian, right? I am a radical, a rebel. I like to think that I'm a little bit different in that particular way. That well, it's entirely possible for us in the Jewish community today to reject that rejection. Right? We can absolutely reject that rejection and reclaim for ourselves a rightful place within the community. There is no reason that Torah and Mishnah and Midrash and Talmud and all these great spiritual works of meaning do not belong to me and to us also. And so I, in fact, decided to reject the rejection and say, you know what? This stuff is mine too, and now you got to deal with me because I'm 2.5 minutes over.
Oh, let's have the other microphone for Sharon. So, Sharon and Darby, you've given us tremendous. We need the stand. We need the stand. Great. All right. Beautiful. Thank you. All right. All right. Thank you both so much for not only your incredible words of wisdom, but also for your willingness to share your own stories. And to share the particulars of your journeys, your path to where you are. I want to ask you to reflect. You've both given us a glimpse. You spoke very much about defiance. Sharon, you spoke very beautifully about the role that fidelity to tradition plays. So if I may be so bold, I'd like to ask you now to say, if we imagine that some blend of defiance and fidelity, hard questions, right, critical questions, and profound respect and love, right? That these are, in fact, I suspect, right, a part of both of your paths. Would you be willing to speak to us a little bit, right, about the other side? Right? Sharon, I might ask you, are there places where you found yourself pushing against something? Darby, are there places where you have found fidelity to be important?
I have to say that as an Orthodox woman with a physical and a speech disability, I am consistently pushing against something. Even being a female executive director of an Orthodox organization with a speech disability is very challenging. So what do I do? The key to addressing the Orthodox world is to raise questions that the Talmud is all about raising questions and examining issues. And this is the way that I go about raising awareness within the Orthodox community that I do respect and I do uphold. When I go to a rabbi and to ask about inclusion and access, I have to put it in terms of what we value as an Orthodox community, meaning being responsible to one another to make sure that each one of us can do the mitzvot that we need to do, making sure that we can pray to Hashem in the community, because that's a priority in our community. I don't go to our rabbanim and say, we have rights to pray. I say, the community needs us. Hashem, God, wants this to happen because A, B, C, and D. So it's all about framing, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, of course, fidelity. So I want to preempt my answer to your question by establishing what I believe to be a truth for all of us, which is that it's my belief that none of us here know what we're doing on this planet. I believe we all think we know, and I believe we all have ideas. Some of us may believe very passionately that we know, but it is my belief that none of us actually know, with capital T, the truth of what the experience of human existence is all about. Therefore, we're all searching. Therefore, spirituality for many of us is one of the ways that we orient our paths through our life. It's one of the ways that we derive meaning from our existence. The stories we tell ourselves about why we're here and how we're supposed to live and what we're supposed to be, how we treat other people and what we're supposed to be doing while we have this precious gift of life is what gives our very lives meaning. My argument for fidelity is that the stories and the wisdom and the teachings of the Jewish spiritual path belong to people with disabilities as well, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so, even though deaf people for centuries have not had access to the wisdom of Torah and of the Jewish spiritual path, we should. And when we do, it is the fidelity to that path that ultimately gives my life the meaning that I derive from it. Part of it, and part of the way you identify and understand, I think, the Jewish spiritual path comes from, depending on what your perspective of Judaism is. What is the essence of Judaism and the essence of the Jewish path, spiritual path, as it would? And I think that, again, the categories are artificial and far-reaching, but for the sake of conversation, to break it down into two very rough, very overgeneralized and broad categories, one possibility to say, well, the essence of Judaism is a fixed, inherited body of knowledge and tradition that must be enacted and lived out exactly the way it has always been done. Right? Torah Sinai. Torah from Mount Sinai given to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses on Mount Sinai, needs to be lived out today the way it has always been lived according to Jewish understanding. There is another perspective on the essence of Judaism and Judaism as a spiritual path, which says that what Judaism actually is, at its heart and at its essence, it is an evolving civilization. It is an evolving entity that has always evolved. From the moment, as the mythic story goes, Torah was revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. From that moment forward, what Judaism has looked like in any given moment in history, in any given generation, it has looked a little bit different, and it has been lived out a little bit differently, and it has continued to evolve. Both perspectives are valid, both perspectives are right. I'm not trying to set one up against the other, but depending on what your perspective is, I think you begin to have room to play with where you push and where you experience your fidelity, so to speak. Whether you are being, I don't know how you say fidelity, but whether you are being fidelity-like, whatever, to the nature of something that evolves, or whether you're experiencing fidelity to something that is static, fixed, and the goal is to keep it from changing.
So, you know, a lot of times when we think about the question of Judaism and disability, or Judaism and deafness, we ask the question, we're inclined to ask the question, what does the tradition say about disability or deafness? And as you're both talking, I hear glimpses of a different question, and I want to ask it to you now. That is, Sharon, you said that when you approach rabbis, you tend to say, you need us, right? I'd love to know, what is it, in your experience or from your perspective, what's one thing or one piece, right, that disability experience gives to the tradition? Darby, maybe this is a question about deaf gain, right? What is it that deaf, capital D, deaf experience offers to tradition? Offers to spiritual life, however you want to frame that. Great.
I don't. Okay. I don't see disability as separate from any other life situation. And this is what we're trying to get across to our community, that, that every single one of us has our challenges. I have an obvious challenge. Someone in this room and I say this with a heavy heart, maybe going home to an abusive situation. How do we compare our experiences so to extricate my life as a person with a disability as some kind of other experience from every one of us has a unique life experience. And when we come to God, we come to God with that fullness of experience. So what I think I'm saying to the Jewish community is, don't be afraid of my experience or of Darby's experience. You can embrace our experiences and not be afraid of them.
Beautifully said. That's Dr. Father. You hear Sharon and myself, and I think many in the Jewish community talk about community a lot. We say the word community a lot. Judaism, one of our most cherished teachings from Rabbi Hillel, Al Tiprot min hatzibor. One should not separate oneself from the community. The community is paramount, I think, in just about any approach to Judaism. So then the question that has to be asked is, what is community? What makes community? And my argument when I approach this question is, and I speak with synagogues in JCCs all over, and if they want to talk about disability access, what would it mean, and what would it look like, and how would we do it if we wanted people with disabilities in our community? And my usual response is to that, they're not here already? Then you don't have a community. Right? If your community does not, in essence, reflect the diversity and the spectrum of humanity as God created us, then you don't have a community. You have a private country club. If everybody in your group of people, that get together looks like each other, reflects the same socioeconomic background, reflects the similar walks of life, reflects the same skin color, reflects the similar whatever it is, you don't actually have a community. You have a private group of people. So what you're talking about is, how do you create community? You have a group of people that want to create a community. That's a wonderful place to begin. And what does it look like, and how do you become a community that actually reflects the diversity of creation as we were created? So the question is not, how can we, kind-hearted, good-thinking, good-feeling, God-fearing, able-bodied people welcome those with disabilities into our community?
Yes.
The question, and Sharon asked this question beautifully as well. The question, who are the accommodations for? Nothing makes me crazy more than someone says, we'd like to build a ramp so that people in wheelchairs can get up on the bima. The ramps aren't for them. They're for you.
Yes.
Because if the people in the wheelchairs aren't on your bima, you don't have a community. You're not fulfilling a mitzvot. The ramp is for you. Well, gee, we don't have the money to provide an American Sign Language interpreter, and maybe the deaf person doesn't really need one. The interpreters are not for the deaf people. If now DeMarco was here, giving the same presentation that I was giving about his experiences on Dancing with the Stars, you would all be handicapped. Because he's doing just fine, according to the millions of followers on social media that he had, and the people that are in love with him all over the world. He's doing just fine. But his first language is American Sign Language. And if that's the language he came and spoke to you in, guess what? you would need an ASL interpreter. So the question is not, how can we make our community accessible to people with disabilities, and how can we find the funding so that we can bring these poor, handicapped souls, everybody knows what that was, right? Into our wonderful, beautiful, whole community. The question is, how do you create a community? Who needs to be there? And how are you going to get them there? And who are these so-called accommodations really for?
Right. I just want to raise that, and this isn't a big picadillo, but unlike another term, but inclusion does bother me a bit. The term inclusion does bother me a little bit because you said there's this larger power saying we are doing inclusion, and it sets up like a power inequality, and so I have a little bit of the reservation about the term inclusion, because who's including who?
Yeah.
Okay, but we do want to become an inclusive community. So, and we have to work on that. Not only that, we never know when any one of us is going to fall into that category of feeling excluded.
So it's been my privilege already. Yeah, please, of course.
So another thing that, there's a lot of things that bug me. I'm sure there are a lot of things that bug you. One of the things that bugs me is a room full of people, so-called able-bodied people, like you definitely, because that's the experience I can speak from most personally. Nothing bugs me more than a room full of hearing people talking about what to do for deaf people, right? Nothing bugs me more. How do we bring deaf people into our community? Or how can we make something accessible to deaf people when there's no deaf person in the room? Drives me nuts. So there's a new catchphrase, not that new actually, relatively new catchphrase in the disability access community. I suspect you are all familiar with it, but this feels like a moment to remind us of it, which is, again, who's including who. The catchphrase in the disability community is nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Nothing about us without us. So you have a conversation about including us into your community. We need to be part of that conversation. You can't have a conversation about us if we're not already there. The conversation is flawed from the beginning.
So I've gotten to ask 2 questions. I feel pretty privileged to have done that. So I'm going to now, we've got about 10 minutes left in our time together. I want to open it up to all of you. And I see one already. That's Lauren. I'm going to send the mic back. If someone would take the mic to Lauren in the back for a question. Make sure that mic is live.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear from you. I admire your work for a very long time. And I guess my question, I do really like the way that Sharon, you specifically were talking about the nature of obligation different than how we have an obligation always have to counsel for one another. And I'm wondering, how what are some practical ways that we found that kind of framing that helps you move communities to more inclusiveness and accessibility into those roles that you are operating?
The quintessential example is the mikvah right now. Because married women are obligated to go to mikvah. Therefore, well, according to the Orthodox way, so therefore the community is obligated to make that mikvah accessible. That's a very easy example. But then you go to the obligation to, as we say, be a part of the community. Okay, how can you build a synagogue, or how can you have a Torah class and not provide sign language interpreters if you're excluding people who are deaf from fulfilling the mitzvah of being part of the community? Okay, so that's the way we talk about how important this is. I mean, of course, we talk about Tselem Elohim being created in the image of God. Yes, we talk about that, and that every one of us has value. But these are different ways of showing that these are eternal values and not just subject to whim and to subjective values.
Two things. Number one, in Jewish communal life, people with disabilities are often regarded as a mitzvah project, becoming the vehicle for which other Jews can perform the commandments in these votes. And really, the obligation to perform these votes is really something for everyone. So that's number one, and that you kind of have to do it. I'd like to ask your kind of your thoughts on the term itself, inclusion. Inclusion has been quite a watered down term these days. Inclusion can be, oh yes, we have inclusion because we have a class, a separate class, or we have a separate service, or we have, yes, people are included because they live in group homes, and they come here once a month for services.
Hey.
And yeah, by the way, they want to sit at a separate table. What is the language to either replace the word inclusion and exclusion, to create that community, that ideology and practice of community, the ideology that then informs the idea that community is only whole, and all of us belong.
Good news, we already have it. We have access, we have accommodations, we have opportunity, okay? We accommodate each other. We provide opportunities for all. You know, in the 90s, we always had access and opportunity. That's what we advocated when we advocated for disability issues. Access and opportunity. Opportunity to what? And also acceptance. Many people now use the term acceptance, that we accept each other as we are, who we are. So those are some very good words that don't set up this hierarchy of who's including who. Darby?
It's a great question. I usually land on community and blowing up the definition of it, right? When we talk about the community, my first question is, who are we talking about? Are we talking about a section of the community, or are we talking about the whole community? Exactly who is in this community that we're talking about, whether it's the JTC, synagogue, and whatnot. And continue to try to, and I feel a little bit like I'm repeating myself, but I continue to try to point out what the loss is if you don't actually create community to the folks who are gathering, whether it's for a synagogue service or a JTC program or what have you. What's the loss if it's not a real community? What's the not gain, right? What's lost if you don't actually have a real community gathered for Shabbat worship or for whatever it is? And to make sure that people understand that community is essential to the fullest possible experience of Jewish life. So I teach and I preach for people to say yes, right? The word should always be yes. Particularly, I don't know if we're going to run out of time. So I wanted to, it's a little off your question, but I wanted to see the opportunity to share that one of the greatest pieces of teaching that I learned from one of my rabbinic mentors is if you want to see the real value of a community, you look at their budget, right?
Yeah.
You want to see the real value of an organization or of a community, you look at their budget. Because if a deaf person or a person in a wheelchair calls and says, I'd like to come to a service, if the words are, we don't have the funds for it, or we can't afford, we don't have money in the budget, we're sorry, we wish we had money in the budget for an ASL interpreter, then you have to reflect back to the organization, well, gee, that says a lot about who you are then, right? Because that is the clearest reflection of your values at work in the world. If you don't budget in, if this is not a part of your understanding of who you are and how you're going to orient yourself to the society around you, then that's kind of revealing, and quite frankly, I think you're missing a significant piece of teaching from the Jewish faith tradition at the very least.
I just want to echo what Darby just said. Yad Hazakah is by far a well-to-do organization. We get by on God's breath. But we always have a budget for communication access. Whatever we can put into that line, we put into that line. So I don't want to hear any other organization that has even, 10% more than what we have complain that they don't have money to create a line for communication access.
Before I take another question, there's going to be a fire alarm somewhere in the next 10 minutes. It's just a testing. It's not trying to put out the fire on the stage. But you don't have to do anything. You don't have to exit or anything. That's just an alert.
Great. So Darby, I'll give it to you for your.
Okay. So I did want to add one final point in general about deafness and the deaf experience, which is that once again, I feel different. I feel a little odd because there's different challenges in creating communities where deaf people feel like we're really part of the community because we're dealing with a language barrier, which just creates a difference in the deaf experience. The reason it felt important to say that is I wouldn't want anyone to leave here with the idea that we can, quote unquote, include deaf people in our community simply by providing an ASL interpreter, right? Because the language access to the service itself is only a very small piece of a whole cultural communal experience which has a lot of different tricky parts to it, which is one of the reasons why deaf community and deaf Jewish community has largely been a separate entity for many years. And I'm not quite sure if that's going to change or if that ought to change. I'm still very much exploring, can a deaf and hearing Jewish community pray together? What does that look like? You know, whose interest is that really in? Who would such an experience serve the most? Who's making the accommodation to be uncomfortable, right? Who's stepping outside their comfort zone? All these questions. I don't actually have answers to them yet. They're still very much, as I continue to explore my teaching forward, trying to figure out what that means and what that looks like for the deaf Jewish experience. So.
I want to thank you both so much for all that you have shared, for your words, for your presence, for your humor, for your profound spirit. So thank you for being with us. And,